Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Welcoming Wellness, where we are empowering mental health. My name is Robin, and I'm going to be your moderator and guide you through the process this afternoon. Welcoming Wellness is a mental health initiative of White Plains United Methodist Church in Cary, North Carolina. We have today Khris Ford, who is an advocate and a very experienced person in grief support. And we are absolutely thrilled to have Khris with us because we're all going to deal with grief at some point in time in our lives. And I, for one, want to know how to do that better. And she's going to talk about complicated grief and how unresolved grief affects our long-term mental health. So let's give Khris a hand and turn it over to her.
In grief, we carry ourselves in tension. And it becomes so, quote, natural to be in tension that we forget that there is another way that our body functions much better. This way of holding ourselves is not normal and is not the healthier way to be. And we want to introduce that constantly and be reminding our bodies of that in the midst of grief. I want to begin by just giving you a few statistics. 2.6 million deaths occur each year in the United States. That means we have about 13 million people who are grieving. About 5 people per death. And in fact, there's probably a lot more than that. Every 10 minutes, a child dies in the United States. That means a family is grieving. 7 to 10% of those who experience a loss will have complicated grief. And we're going to talk about what that means. It's probably higher than 10% because it's unreported a great deal of the time. In North Carolina, 1 in 10 children will lose a parent by age 18. And by age 25, that doubles. 540,000 will have experienced the death of a parent or sibling in a year. That's a lot of grieving children and young adults as well. And as I talk, you'll understand why I brought those statistics in. So I want to introduce a definition of grief. I suspect everybody in this room has your own definition of what that is. But this is a definition that I think is a little different than most of us have been introduced to. And it's been a very meaningful one for me. Grief is a normal response to the loss of something or someone or an individual to which we are attached. The process of grief is one of discovering the extent and the limits of what is lost, as well as the possibilities resulting from the loss. So most of us, when we think about grief, we don't think about a process of exploration. At least I didn't. And I certainly haven't thought about the possibilities. And yet, that really is a piece, an important piece, of this process of grief. I want to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about me and what brought me into this world of grief. As a child, I experienced the death of 2 siblings, quite young, and also the abandonment by my father as an infant, which is another loss. As an adult, I experienced the death of my 16-year-old son and my husband in 2015. I was sort of born into loss. And it has been somewhat of a fascination. That maybe sounds a little sick, but you know, life gives us things and we learn how to work that in ways that can build bridges and also enrich our own lives. And so this world of grief came to me. I didn't go to it. And what I've come to know is that every opportunity to share that is an opportunity for me to continue to heal and to help others do the same. So that's how I came about this. And I have come to know that there is an extent and a limit to every loss, and there is possibility. So I want to talk a little bit about grief basics to begin with. Some of this is going to be old stuff for some of you. Some of it will seem new. I think the first thing, and as it said that in the definition, but grief is a normal response. There is nothing abnormal about grieving when you've experienced a loss. The experience of grief after that loss is a unique experience for every single individual. There is no one way to do this. It's as unique as your fingerprint. I remember a number of years ago, probably 30 years ago now, someone asked me if I would come and do a talk on abnormal grief at their church. He said, "You have an hour." And I said, "Well, that'll take me about 15 seconds. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Because the only time grief is abnormal is if someone is harming themselves or someone else. That's it. I have nothing else to say." Abnormal grief is only abnormal if we're harming ourselves or someone else. So I want to tell you a funny story that people might have thought was abnormal, but it really wasn't. I was directing programs at a grief center in Houston, and we had a family that came because the grandfather, who had been beloved by everyone in the family, had died. And that family had a ritual on Sunday evenings. They went to the cemetery and they poured a bottle of wild turkey on his grave. What do you think? So some people might have gone, "Oh my Lord, something is really wrong with that family." You know, they weren't hurting anything. They weren't hurting themselves and they weren't harming anybody else. And what they were doing is remembering their grandfather in a way that might have been not our way to do it, but it brought that family together every Sunday evening to remember their grandfather. So, grief is unique. And after doing this for over 30 years, I've heard a lot of unique situations. Third, grief is cumulative. Now, what does that mean? That means that from the time we are born, we are collecting, if you will, experiences of loss. Some are really big ones and some are little ones. And we put those experiences in a backpack. I'm going to use that as a metaphor. So maybe my first loss experience is the time that I'm at second grade out on the playground and everybody's picking teams. And guess who's last? Because I was a miserable athlete. But in my little heart of hearts, I took that as they didn't like me. That was a loss in that little body of mine. And I filed that away in a backpack in the back. That even to this day, when I'm asked to participate in athletic stuff, that little thing comes up. So that's in my backpack. Along with all of the other experiences of loss that we have throughout our lifetime. So that when something of great significance, such as the loss of a child or a spouse or a best friend or a mother happens, then all of the remnants of those experiences of loss that we have had that were not fully processed rise up to the surface again. And our experience of grief over that particular very significant loss seems bigger than life itself. And that's because it is. It's bigger than that one life. That's not to diminish in any way the size and importance of the grief of the loss of a person. It's huge. But tacked on to that are all these other things, remnants of losses. So grief is cumulative. One of the things that I often do when I'm doing training is I have a sheet that has about 70 or 75 common kinds of losses on it for adults. And I invite them to look at that list of losses and check the ones they've experienced. Not because I want them to get overwhelmed. No, what I want them to do is then look at those that they've experienced and ask, did anyone say to me after that, gosh, I'm really sorry that you had that experience or that you had that loss? Did I have a witness that affirmed it? Because if we don't, then we probably don't process that loss, right? Because we think to ourselves, oh, that's no big deal. I shouldn't be feeling that. So what I want people to understand is that we file those things away, and that's why those remnants are there. So grief is also a whole person experience. It's not just head and heart. They tell us that, but it's not. It's a physical experience. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I'm guessing that anybody in this room who's grieved knows that your body holds a lot of that grief. And we have stomach aches, we have headaches, we have aches and pains, and it's not psychosomatic. We have stomach aches. We have headaches. Our body carries this experience. So it's a whole person experience. Our spiritual life, our intellect, the way we think is impacted by it, everything. The next one says, grief unfolds over time, often resurfacing at pivotal life events. So it not only resurfaces when the next loss comes along, but for example, a number of years ago, 20 years ago, when my daughter was getting married, about 2 weeks before the wedding, she really plunged into this depression that I had never seen her experience before. And she was missing her brother. This was an occasion when he should have been there. And she was grieving that loss again. So anytime we go through a pivotal life event, it could be for a young person getting their license, going away to college, going away on their first date, the prom. For us, it's every job change, every new relationship, all of those pivotal life events. Grief comes back up to the surface again. It's not the same grief because we're coming at it in a different place in our life, but it is grief. Grief isn't about forgetting. Rather, I like to think of it as remembering, re-membering. Remembering the parts of ourself that get lost in the midst of the experience of grief. I've often had the image of my life and my way of thinking and feeling in the midst of it when after both of my major losses, the big major losses as an adult, that it was like I had a jigsaw puzzle out on the table working on it. And someone came along and flipped that table and took away the lid. And the reason I say took away the lid is because, if you're like me, I cheat. I look at the lid when I'm doing the puzzle. Because I don't have any idea what that's supposed to look like when I put it back together. No idea. It's about remembering those parts that are inside here. You know as well as I do that one of the ways that most of the world out there wants to help us is to encourage us to forget and move on. Maybe they don't use those words. Maybe it's, well, it's really time for you to start thinking about the future, those kinds of words. And yes, there will be a time when thinking about the future will be appropriate. But that's our timing, every individual person's timing as to when they're ready for that. It's not about forgetting. And my experience in working with hundreds of people is that the more we try to get people to forget in all the ways we do, the more they're going to dig their heels in and not forget. Because as somebody who's lost someone, the last thing I want is to forget. Can I hear an amen on that one? We don't want to forget. And we don't want anybody else to forget either, by the way. That's important. Grief changes us. That's another grief basic. We're not going to go unchanged out of an experience of loss. We just won't. Because it is a whole body experience, so we are going to be changed. And what I've learned over the years is that that isn't the bad news. It feels like it in the moment, but it's not the bad news. Because if we allow it, this experience of grief, the extent, the limits, and the possibilities means that we can have a deeper, richer, more compassionate life as a result. That as that place within us, that wound, if you want to think of it in that way, that deep, deep wound begins to be filled once again with light and love, we are richer, deeper people. So it does change us if we say yes to it. And last, in terms of our grief basics, grief needs to be affirmed and witnessed for healing to occur. And that's what I was saying about that inventory. All of us need to have our loss affirmed and witnessed. And that's what we do for one another in community. That's what Stephen Ministry does at a church. That's what grief support groups do. That's what counselors and spiritual directors and people who come together to help and pastors, they witness and affirm. And we need that on our journey. For the adolescent, grief can amplify and speed up development. It can mean that a child at age 14 begins to have the depth and the wisdom sometimes of a 19 or 20-year-old kid or a 30-year-old because they have lived a life experience that has brought some of those developmental tasks a little bit ahead. Now, as I say that, I want to juxtapose that with this. Trauma, however, stalls development. So there is a difference there. Traumatic childhood experiences often stops young people in a particular developmental phase of their emotional development, their spiritual development, their physical development, whatever it is. It may not be all of those. It may be one of those. So I want to be sure that we show the difference there between the two. Young adults and adolescents in particular, their responses to grief, so if we're walking around the school with a 16-year-old, for example, who's experienced the death of a parent or a best friend or a brother or sister, the way we're going to see it is going to look different than it would in one of you. Because what happens is it's usually expressed in very short periods of time and very intensely. Whereas with most adults, it is a long span of intensity. It's not at all unusual for a teen, or a young adult for that matter, to have a really tough afternoon, something brought something to the surface, and for a few hours there's a lot of intensity, and the next thing you know, they're out at the baseball field involved in their team sport, or going out with the girls, or whatever it is. That's just how they do it developmentally. It doesn't mean they're over it. Guilt and a sense of unfinished business is huge with all of us, but in particular for young adults and adolescents, because there is so much of life ahead of them, so much of the future that they have in their heads envisioned that will not happen in the way they envisioned it. The younger the child or adolescent, the more the guilt often comes in because of the way in which the ego plays such a part in them developmentally in those years. In the very young child, that is absolutely true. Young children take responsibility for almost any awful thing that happens in a family. After all, think about it. They think they're the center of the world, and everything that happens because of them, right? I mean, that's what we do when we're little kids. So if somebody's really angry in the household, or depressed, or crying a lot, a young child believes, I must have done something. Now that gets better as they get older, but there's still an edge of that. The other piece with adolescent and young adult is that, I don't know how many of you have adolescents and young adults around, but sometimes those relationships get a little conflictual during those years, right? So when that happens and then someone dies, guess what? All of that comes back up again as guilt. I wish that had not happened. I wished I had said something differently. So that's part of what goes on. Unfortunately, the other piece of adolescent and young adult grief is that support is often lacking. And I'm not pointing the finger at the family there. It's lacking because they don't ask for help. And often when they do ask for help, they're not asking people that are ready to give it to them. They don't know who will be able to hear their story and who will be able to support them. And sometimes when they share it with a friend, it's too much for a friend. And the first time that happens, then that's maybe the last time that child opens up. It's also true that in a family where there are major, huge gaps, losses, the death of a parent, the death of a sibling, that it's hard for the other adult or adults in that family to be fully present to what's going on with the kids in the household because they are grieving so acutely. And the child, and especially adolescents and young adults, tend to take on the responsibilities and not ask for help. So that's why they don't get the support that they need. The last point there is that grief at any age often impacts our thoughts, feelings, physical health, and behaviors. And so when you think about an adolescent or a young adult who's experienced a major loss, their entire being, just like adults, is being engaged in this. And that often means that adolescents and sometimes young adults engage in risky behaviors, engage in ways that are living out a story, for many that is a distorted story. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. When I was running the Grief Center in Houston, we had a very active older teen and young adult group. And many in that group had lost a parent or a sibling to a sudden death at a young age. So the parent died at 40 or 35. And part of the way in which some of those young people integrated that story into their own life was to believe that their life might not be any longer than their parents'. So what difference does it make what my behavior is if I'm only going to live to be 35 anyway? Whatever. Have you ever seen that with a teen? That kind of attitude? And it's often that internal story that my story may be the same. So it's important for us when we're working with young adults and with adolescents to help them know there's another story, a story to be rewritten. So if we think about loss on a continuum, and I'm going to say the left hand, I guess it is the left hand over here. No, well, it's the right one over here. Okay, so if we think about the continuum beginning here with a loss that is an anticipated loss at the end of life, an older age, we might think of that as a grief or loss that might be easier to manage, easier to grieve than the other end of the spectrum, which is a sudden, violent death. Now, all of that being said, when I talk about anticipated grief being, quote, easier, nothing is easy. No kind of death is easy. And sometimes when we have anticipated deaths, that comes after many years of caregiving, many years of grieving a loss that's coming, and losses that are happening day by day. So that means that the person, the spouse, the caregiver, the children are depleting the resources, the internal resources, and maybe the external resources along the way, which means that when the death actually happens, they're not in the best place to begin to live into the death of a loved one. So when I say that, I recognize there are lots of circumstances in which it's not easier, okay? However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, when we talk about sudden, violent deaths, we're talking about things like murder, an automobile accident. What might be some other sudden, violent deaths? Anybody have any ideas?
Fire.
Sorry?
Fire.
Fire, flooding. What else? Sorry.
Suicide.
I'm sorry.
Suicide.
Suicide, yes, of course. Suicide. When those things happen, there is always a traumatic edge. Always. No exceptions. And that means complicated grief. That means complicated grief. Because in an instant, or close to an instant, a person's life is turned upside down, inside out, in every way possible. The very assumptions that we have about the way life works, about the way the world works, about the way God works, whether those assumptions are true or not, if we've held them, we lose the reality because those assumptions don't work anymore. For example, most of us who are parents would say that we assume that our children will bury us, not that we will bury our child. That's an assumption. We don't talk about it. We don't need to because we just believe that's true. Right? So when it happens, it's like somebody pulled the floor out from underneath us. It is a total disorientation. And there are many, many, many more of those assumptions that we buy into and we don't talk about it, but when it's not working for us anymore, we know something's off. So complicated grief is most often the result of the death of a child or a spouse. It may even be more complicated, if you will, depending on the child and our relationship with that child, what has happened during their lifetime. If it's a spouse, it might depend on how many years we've been married, the texture and the framework of our marriage relationship. And that's not to say that if it's conflictual, we don't grieve. No, 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 no. We probably grieve twice as much because it's a double whammy. If it's not the relationship we had hoped for, then when the person dies, there's no chance that it will be. So it's extra complicated. Also, it's the result of violent deaths, murder, car, bike accidents, drowning, as we were talking about. It's the result of a close or dependent relationship with the deceased. So it could be a grandparent, it could be a best friend. It's about the attachment. It's about the attachment. All of those particular situations bring about complicated grief. So what is complicated grief? Another word for it in the diagnostic manual is prolonged or chronic grief. So let me tell you, first of all, that as a retired grief and trauma therapist, there's probably nothing more frustrating for me than to look at the DSM, the diagnostic manual, and see their explanations as if a year was a long time. After you've been married 47 years, that you would still be grieving after a year. Now, does that seem abnormal to you? No. It's a drop in the bucket. However, some group of people deemed that this was called complicated chronic grief. So just know that those are labels put on often by people who've never grieved. So there we are. And it is what we have to work with when it comes to insurance and having to put a diagnosis on our work. So what are some of the signs and symptoms of complicated grief? If you've heard much about trauma, you're going to hear some things that sound familiar. First of all, having overwhelming, intrusive, or preoccupying thoughts about the loss after 1 year. Okay? According to them, it's perfectly normal to have it up to a year, but after that, not so much. Don't agree, but that's the way it is. So does that mean that there's something horribly wrong with you? No. It probably means that your relationship, whether it was conflictual or incredibly loving, is still doing its work in you. That you're still adjusting to what it means to live into the reality of this death. Feeling intense longing or emotional pain. Duh. Who has ever grieved the loss of somebody they loved and didn't long for them for a very long time? Of course we do. Denying, avoiding, or ignoring reminders of loss, or surrounding yourself with reminders of a loss. So when our son died, For the better part of 2 years, my in-laws denied that he was gone by not allowing us to talk about him in their home. All of his pictures disappeared. All of our family pictures in which he was one of the people disappeared. They were simply in total denial of his death. That was their way of coping. It was really hard for us, but that was their way of coping. I've also been in homes where I almost felt inundated by pictures of a person who has died for a very long time afterwards, because that person needs to surround themselves with the presence of their loved one. Another way of coping. Feeling like you no longer have a purpose after a loss. I think one of the hardest things about grief, period, but particularly the loss of a spouse or a child, is our identity gets lost. I remember asking a week after Stephen died, my son, am I still a mother? Now, mind you, I had an 11-year-old daughter who I adored then and I still adore, but there was a part of me that didn't quite know what to do with that identity. When John died, am I still a wife? What about that identity? Identity is a huge piece of grief work. Figuring out who we are again. Or who do we want to be? Maybe we got lost in that relationship and we want to be someone else. Grief has, remember, extent, limit, and what? Possibilities. So those kind of symptoms, if you will, although I hate calling them symptoms, realities of grief, are what define this chronic loss or prolonged loss, complicated grief. I think one of the things that wasn't mentioned when I said generally we think about this as complicated grief, and that is what I call stacked grief. That is people who have had multiple significant losses in a fairly short period of time. And by short, it could be 10 years. But when we have multiple significant losses, it's hard to know. How do you grieve? How do you grieve one loss when you've also have these? What do you do with those huge feelings? So stacked grief becomes very complex and complicated and is prolonged because we can't grieve them all at once. We have to grieve them individually. And being able to do that takes time, lots of time. Grief isn't limited to death loss at all. We grieve when we have relationship changes. We grieve when there's any abuse of any kind. We grieve over job or vocational changes, chronic illness, geographic moves, change in family dynamics, and many, many more. We could sit here all afternoon and talk about non-death losses. And these are significant. Many of them are very significant. Abuse of any kind is a significant loss to identity and all kinds of other losses. And we cannot diminish in any way the long-term impact of that. I think it's important to note here that it's not just positive, not just negative losses, I guess, when you think about it that way. Sometimes even positive change brings about grief. I mean, think about I can think about this, retirement. I'm not retired anymore. I thought I was, but I'm not. But when I first stepped into that for a few months, my identity was like, oh, who am I? What does that mean for me now? and walking away, because in our retirement, we moved from Texas to North Carolina. And so my tribe was in Austin. There was some grief there. When kids graduate from high school, if they're willing to admit it, there's a lot of grief along with the salutations and the celebrations, because there's much that's being left behind. Anytime we make a choice, folks, we leave something behind. Now, we don't always grieve what we've left behind, but sometimes, quite often we do, even though we're very excited about what's in front of us. Getting married. Wow, wonderful step. But there's some things I left behind. Okay? So when we're thinking about that backpack of losses, we have to remember that many of them are probably non-death losses. PTSD typically is not thought about as in response to a non-death loss. The only time that they ever think about that, do that, is if abuse is involved or war. Any other kind of PTSD that comes from a non-death loss is usually not we can't diagnose it as PTSD. We diagnose it as complicated grief. It's an interesting thing. But the thing is that indirect exposure to some sort of traumatic event, indirect exposure to the details of a traumatic event, can cause us to have a traumatic response. Intrusive images, avoidance of anything related to this, hyperarousal. And so we have to keep in mind that when we are looking at losses, many of these are losses that come with a traumatic edge. In today's world, because we have this screen in front of us, whether it's here or on our wall somewhere, that gives us images that can be very disturbing and that can leave us with imprints that we carry around. So we can be traumatized as a secondary witness, TV. It's one of the reasons why all mental health people will tell you, limit your exposure. It's kind of not what we do as human beings. We kind of have this odd need to see it every time, but we need to turn it off and limit it. So some of the demographic risk factors, if you will, according to statistics, for complicated grief are, number one, more women experience complicated grief than men. Now, frankly, I think that's because it's not reported. Women are more likely to ask for help and go to a mental health professional than men. We know that. But according to the statistics, females have more complicated grief. Low social support of a person who is in grief is a risk factor for complicated grief. Why? Because we need to be witnessed and affirmed. So if we don't have a community of support around us, it's going to complicate things. If the loss has traumatic circumstances, it's going to complicate things. If we have underlying mental health circumstances. So if a person, for example, experiences a traumatic loss and they have already been managing depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, any of those things to begin with, then the experience of that grief, that traumatic kind of grief, is going to amplify whatever other mental health issue may be there. And I always suggested as a therapist that if they were on a medication, that they talk to whomever issued that prescription and let them know what they're going through, because our body chemistry changes in grief. Our body chemistry changes in trauma, and we may need to adjust medications accordingly. Not always, and I would never suggest that because I'm not a medical doctor, but I do ask people to check that out. Attachment style. So one of the things that we're learning more and more and more about is how our attachment style as a young child impacts us throughout our life. And what I mean by that is some of us grew up in families where our family life was warm and loving and emotionally close and consistent. We kind of knew who had our back all the time. That's a secure attachment. But there's a whole lot of us who didn't grow up with a secure attachment because the family dynamics were not such that we had two loving parents who were able to give us what we needed and who were, for the most part, emotionally secure themselves. Many people grew up in homes where there was not an expectation that they were going to get what they needed emotionally from their parents. Their parents simply weren't available for that. If they were dismissed as a child and their needs were not met, they may have had avoidant attachment patterns. And there are 3 or 4 other types. Those kinds of patterns as young people follow us throughout our life in terms of the way we trust people, in terms of the way we build relationships. And so it makes sense that, of course, it's going to be a factor in our grief as well. And then the last demographic risk is a history of childhood trauma. So some of you may remember, if you were here a few months ago, it was in November, I think, someone was here from Alliance who talked about ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and how often when there are multiple ACEs or experiences within a lifetime, that these bring about changes in a child and bring about changes in young adults and adults. So examples of adverse childhood experiences might be violence, abuse, or neglect, or being a witness to violence in your home or your community. Death of a family member by suicide. Contributing environmental factors are problems with substance abuse in a family, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation, instability due to incarceration of a household member. And there are lots of examples besides the ones that are up there, as well as contributing environmental factors. But those are some of the things that often we come into adulthood with those already in our backpack. So when we think about the long-term impact, what I say is the long-term impact of unresolved childhood trauma, but it may also be unresolved adolescent or young adult trauma, is we know from statistics that there is a greater percentage of anxiety, depression, chronic PTSD, and even personality disorders. There is often difficulty building relationships. So you think about the number of times that perhaps someone ends up in an abusive relationship, or maybe a pattern of abusive relationships. I would wonder, can't be sure, can't make an assumption, but I would wonder about whether or not there were some adverse childhood experiences that brought about this way of building relationships amidst abuse. low self-esteem, and negative core beliefs. Every day I encounter people who are struggling with the reality that they are a beloved creature of God. They cannot own that. They cannot receive that. They have such negative core beliefs. Substance abuse and other numbing behaviors are very common where there has been unresolved trauma, whether it was in childhood or adulthood. Chronic health issues. Remember, I said it's a whole body experience. So we are going to have chronic health issues. Our body is carrying this, and we can't hold ourselves in tension. Probably not getting enough sleep, maybe not eating properly for years on end and expect not to have body response to that. So we have chronic health issues. Difficulty with emotional regulation. And what do I mean by that? Difficulty with not erupting like a volcano, going from what I would say 1 to 10 in a nanosecond, is lack of emotional regulation. One of the ways it shows itself. And why would that be? Again, if we are in hyperarousal or we are in tension over a long period of time, the chemistry in our brain shifts and changes, and we cannot regulate emotion in the ways that keep us healthy and keep us in healthy relationships. And then the last unresolved childhood trauma is repetition of generational trauma. So the very thing I mentioned about a pattern of moving into abusive relationships and becoming an abuser. Those kinds of generational traumatic responses often happen out of unresolved grief, unresolved trauma. First of all, I have to use this phrase because I believe it with every cell in my body. Richard Rohr says that if we don't transform it, we will transmit it. And I'm going to say it again because I believe it. If we don't transform it, we transmit it. So if I am living out of fear, or if I am living in anxiety, or if I am living in depression, and I am not doing the work that is needed to begin to transform that, it's not an overnight thing, it's a process. But if I'm not in the midst of doing that, I'm going to transmit it, probably to the people I love the most. And that's how generational trauma happens. So what helps? Let's talk about that. Healthy grieving in the family, first of all. And what do I mean by that? Healthy grieving in the family is acknowledging that grief is going on. I don't know about your family, but when I was growing up, we didn't talk about that stuff. Now, I will say I was taken to a lot of funerals as a little kid. That we did that. But I've worked with a lot of people who never went to a funeral until their child died. They'd never been to a funeral. Because the parents, the grandparents, whoever, the culture of their family was that you don't expose children to those things. So healthy grieving means that we acknowledge that death is a part of life. We talk with children about that. We talk about how that cycle happens in nature. We talk about all of the ways that we live into that. It's part of life. So that when someone dies, everyone in a family has a different need in terms of how they're going to grieve. Because I said, right, everybody's different. So not everybody in the family wants to sit around and talk about memories. I know that. And that's okay. So you don't do it all the time. But you give the people who need to talk about those memories a place to be heard. If it's not in your family, then you find somebody who will listen and wants to hear those stories. It means that when it comes upon an anniversary of a death, that you talk as a family about what you're going to do on that day or not do. And everybody might have a different need, I know, because I've been there. And you try to find a way that everybody gets a little bit of what they need. They're not going to get everything, but a little. So I'm looking at the time. I want to just tell you a little funny story about that. After my son died, Thanksgiving came. He died in May, so it'd been a few months. So I sat down with my husband and my daughter, who was 11, and I said, okay, what do you want to do for Thanksgiving? I knew what I wanted. I wanted to forget the day even happened and just keep going on. But I also knew that might not be what my husband and my daughter wanted. So Jennifer says, my daughter, I want to have a meal just like we always have. We need to have Thanksgiving. She needed normalcy. John said, that's fine, but I don't want any company. Just us. Quite frankly, both of those were my idea of a nightmare, but because I didn't want to cook and I didn't want to be alone. So we compromised, and we did invite one family that we all felt close to and knew we could be real with. And I agreed to cook the things that were essential to Jennifer because John didn't care. So I said, what's essential? You have to make dressing, stuffing. Okay, we'll make stuffing. So we had prime rib and stuffing. And we were sitting at the table eating, and Jennifer begins to sob. I said, honey, what's wrong? There's not any cranberry sauce. I said, well, you didn't tell me you wanted cranberry sauce. I didn't know I needed it. So it's not always easy to compromise and figure out who wants what, but a healthy family talks about it. At least we all knew that none of us were getting everything we wanted. And no, it wasn't a great Thanksgiving, but, you know, we were all together. We showed up. And we remembered Stephen, and that was important. Maintaining structure. I think particularly for parents, the temptation when there's been a death in the family is to let go of everything. I feel so bad for my children. I'm not going to have those rules anymore. We're just going to be. Kids and adolescents and even young adults need structure. They need structure more than they did before because life feels out of control. So structure is important. Patience with the process helps. Folks, this is not a sprint. It's not a 50-yard dash. It's a long race. It's a long run. And we have to be patient with each other. And because none of us do it the same way, we have to suspend judgment about who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. And I can say that because I was really guilty of judging. I regret that. Continuing the connection with the loved one, in other words, remembering in any way that you can when it's needed. Allowing the child, the teen, the young adult continue to be teens and young adults. Remembering that their life is bigger than this loss, even though for us as adults, nothing could seem bigger because it feels like all of us. But for a teen or an adolescent, a young adult, it's one part of their life. It may be a big part, but it's not all of who they are. We have to let them be kids. We need to help them to find supportive peers, help all of us to find supportive peers. In our family, that was not hard for me, but it was very difficult for my husband. And helping him to find men that he could be himself with and let known that he was struggling was hard. And sometimes he needed some help with that. So we helped. Be an empathic listener even when you're also grieving. That's what families do. We need to listen. And it's hard. Because believe it or not, in a family, everyone has a different story about what took place. Have you ever been at a family reunion when someone started telling a story and you thought, I thought I was in the room when that happened, but I don't remember it that way. So a lot of these memories, you may have your own perception of what happened. Try to listen to someone else's perception. And in the case of our children, but even our spouses, talk with them about more than just the loss. Because there is a life we're living in the midst of this. And as a family, we are moving through a life cycle of a family when this is going on too. And we have to remember that and be willing to have conversation about that too. When I find this falls apart and when it's really tragic is when you have a huge loss in a family just about the time when some child is about to go off to college. And that huge disruption that happens, that's a big moment in a family. And we have to be able to talk about that piece, not totally apart from the loss because it's impacted by the loss, but it deserves its own conversation. It deserves its own chapter. So we have to acknowledge that. What else helps? Well, trauma-informed therapy, if that's needed. Self-compassion, which many of us have a really hard time with. We do it well for others, but we don't do it so well for ourselves. And we need to work on that. Gathering a circle of support around ourselves. And sometimes that means building an intentional healing circle for us. That's self-compassion. The expressive arts, I have to say that of all the things that I've engaged in to help me with my grief, nothing has probably helped me more than in music, art, and I'm not an artist. I don't draw a straight line with a ruler. But drawing and using color and all those kinds of things, journaling, poetry, have been extremely helpful. And I encourage those who are in the midst of grief to employ those kinds of tools because they can be extremely helpful.
Thank you so much, Khris. We are very honored to have you with us today. And I know a lot of us have been suffering from a lot of the things that you've talked about. So thank you very much. Our next presentation is going to be on March 9th, and that will be done by Amanda Brundle, who's with NAMI, North Carolina. And if you don't know, NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So I know you won't want to miss that. And I also want to mention that our services are free to the public, but we do accept donations. So if you want to go to our website, which is welcomingwellnessnc.com, there is a Donate Now button, and believe me, you won't miss it. And we would love to have you donate if you feel so led to do so. We thank you very much for being here today.